Saint Teresa saw what happens when hidden affairs leave. Permanent distrust in the heart. Have you ever loved someone completely, given them everything, built a whole life around them, and then found out they were living a double life right beside you? Not just a lie, a second world. Hidden messages, hidden faces, hidden nights. And the worst part is not even the betrayal itself. The worst part is what happens after. Because Teresa of Avila, one of the most spiritually clear-eyed women who ever lived, saw exactly what that kind of hidden sin does to a soul. Not in theory, not in a sermon. She saw it in visions, in the confessional, in the spiritual wreckage that passed through her hands year after year in 16th century Castile. And what she documented tells us something nobody says out loud, that the real destruction from an affair is not the affair. It is the distrust that it plants in the heart forever. A distrust that does not stay quiet. A distrust that spreads. Teresa was born in Avila, Spain, on March 28, 1515. By the time she entered the Monastery of the Incarnation in 1535, at age 20, she had already watched her family fracture under the weight of hidden things. Her father, Alonso de Cepeda, was a converso, a man from a Jewish converted family who hid that lineage from the wider world. Not because he was ashamed of his faith, but because in Spain in the 1500s, to be known as a converso was to lose everything. He lived with a secret that shaped how he moved through every room. He was described by people who knew him as an unusually virtuous man, genuinely pious, genuinely kind. But he was also a man who could never be fully at rest, because full rest requires the absence of anything to protect. And Teresa, who was observant from the time she could speak, watched what the secret did to him. She watched how he held himself differently in public than in private. She watched how certain conversations changed the quality of the air around him. She watched how a man who loved God could also be a man who could not stop managing how he was perceived, because the cost of being fully perceived was too high. Teresa watched that. She absorbed it. She understood from childhood that the things people hide are not neutral. They radiate. They infect the air of a home. They change the temperature in a room. They travel through walls. If you value deeply researched, spiritual, and historical content like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support what we do here. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Also, this script draws from primary documentation in Teresa's own autobiography, known as The Book of Her Life, written between 1562 and 1565, held at the Royal Library of El Escorial in Madrid, and from the critical scholarly work of Rowan Williams in his 2003 study, Teresa of Avila, published by Continuum International, which examines her visions and their psychological and spiritual architecture with unusual precision. Now, back to the story. Teresa entered religious life not out of burning desire, but out of fear. She was clear about that. In her autobiography, she wrote that she chose the convent because she was terrified of marriage. Not because of love, because of what she had seen marriage do to people. Her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, died at 33, worn down by 14 pregnancies and the emotional labor of keeping a household together around secrets her husband could not fully share. Teresa was 12 when her mother died. She did not forget what that looked like. A woman erased slowly, a woman who trusted and was not fully trusted in return, a woman whose heart had been carrying weight that was never meant for one person alone. Inside the convent, Teresa did not find peace right away. She spent nearly 20 years in what she later called a divided life. She was a nun, yes. But she was also entertaining visitors, maintaining social ties, caring what people thought of her, performing holiness without living it all the way through. She called this period the most dangerous time of her life. Not because she was committing scandals, but because she was hiding. She was splitting herself in two. The parlor where she received visitors was one Teresa. The cell where she prayed or tried to pray was another. She was charming, warm, socially skilled, and she was using every one of those gifts as a kind of armor. As long as she was performing for other people, she did not have to sit alone with herself and hear what was actually there. She said in chapter 8 of her autobiography, and this is documented word for word in the original Castilian manuscript, that this kind of inner division was more damaging to the soul than any single dramatic sin, because the dramatic sin, she wrote, you know you have committed. The divided life you convince yourself is fine. That is the first thing Teresa teaches us about hidden affairs. They are not just about the physical act. They are about the architecture of deception that has to be constructed around it. Every affair requires a person to maintain two parallel realities simultaneously. Two sets of stories, two emotional registers, two versions of themselves. And Teresa, who did this herself in a much less extreme way during her years of social performance in the convent, described the interior cost with surgical precision. She said, the soul that lives in division begins to lose its ability to recognize its own truth. It becomes, in her words, like a person walking in fog. You can still move, but you cannot see where you're going. And worse, you stop being sure you ever knew. This is not metaphor. This is psychology that modern researchers have confirmed in studies Teresa could never have read. Dr. Jennifer Freed at the University of Oregon spent decades developing betrayal trauma theory, first published in her 1996 book, Betrayal Trauma: The Logic of Forgetting Childhood Abuse, and her findings map almost exactly onto what Teresa described. When the person who betrays you is also the person your survival depends on, emotionally or practically, the brain does something extraordinary. It suppresses the awareness of the betrayal, not because you are weak, because the cost of knowing is too high. Freud called this betrayal blindness. Teresa called it the fog. Different centuries, different languages, same devastation. Now here is where it gets specific, because Teresa did not just theorize. She was a confessor, a spiritual director, and a woman to whom hundreds of people brought the exact mess of their interior lives. And in the convent communities she reformed and founded, beginning with the first Discalced Carmelite convent of San Jose in Avila in 1562, she encountered women who had carried the weight of discovered infidelity. Some had been the betrayed, some had been the ones who betrayed. And what she observed in both categories was documented in her letters, over 450 of which survive, and in the accounts of her companions, like Maria de San Jose and Ana de Jesus, whose own testimonies were gathered during Teresa's canonization process begun in 1591, 9 years after her death. The betrayed ones, Teresa wrote, suffered from something she called an inability to pray without the wound entering the prayer. She described women who would begin contemplation and find themselves immediately inside the memory of the discovery, not the act itself, the moment they found out, a letter, a change in schedule, a face that stopped being familiar, a hesitation before answering a simple question, the way someone suddenly became interested in their own phone. And Teresa said that wound had a particular quality that other wounds did not have. It was a wound to the perceiving organ itself. It was not like losing a child, which breaks the heart but leaves the mind intact. It was like losing your ability to trust your own reading of reality, because the person who had deceived them had also been the person through whose eyes they had partly understood the world. When that person turned out to be double, everything they had helped you see became suspect. Every shared memory, every reassurance, every year. Cold, this is cold, but it is true. And here's what Teresa said about that specific damage. She said, "It does not heal the way other wounds heal. Most wounds close from the outside in. The body repairs itself at the edges and works toward the center. But distrust after betrayal closes from no direction at all, because every time you approach the center, you find a new reason not to trust your own diagnosis of it. You wonder if you are healing or just suppressing. You wonder if the new person you are with is real or performing. You wonder if your own memory of what love felt like before was accurate or idealized." Teresa wrote that this is one of the most spiritually serious conditions she witnessed. Not because it is a sin, but because it attacks the faculties of the soul that prayer depends on. Faith, she said, is a form of trust extended toward God. And a person whose trust has been architecturally destroyed finds that the very muscles needed for faith have been damaged. She was not condemning the wounded, she was grieving with them, and she was being honest about the timeline. She said in a letter written to her brother Lorenzo de Cepeda in January of 1570 that she had known people to carry this wound for 20 years without it fully resolving. Not because they lacked faith, not because they had not forgiven, but because forgiveness and the restoration of the capacity to trust are not the same thing. You can forgive a person completely and still flinch when someone says exactly what they used to say. You can forgive and still feel your nervous system activate when a phone is left face down on a table. Your mind has forgiven. Your body still has the file open. Now, let us talk about the ones who had the affairs, because Teresa was equally clear-eyed about them, and this is where her observations become even more unsettling. Teresa encountered women and men through her network of confessors and spiritual directors who had carried on hidden relationships for years, some for decades. And what she described in their interior lives was not what most people expect. It was not guilt, or not only guilt, it was something more structural. She said the person who maintains a long deception undergoes a permanent change in how they relate to intimacy, because every act of closeness with the person they are deceiving becomes simultaneously an act of distance. Every "I love you" spoken while hiding something is a sentence that means two opposite things at once. And the soul that speaks in that double register long enough, she wrote, begins to lose access to single register speech entirely. It forgets how to be simply present with another person. It becomes allergic to being fully known, because being fully known now means being found out. Teresa called this the prison of the double life. And she said she had seen people leave their hidden affairs, confess, repent genuinely, and still find themselves unable to be truly intimate for years afterward. Not because the sin was unforgivable, it was forgiven. God forgave it the moment it was repented. But the habits of concealment that a person builds over years of hiding do not dismantle themselves on the day of confession. They are built into the nervous system. They are woven into the reflex patterns of daily interaction. The person who spent 5 years changing the subject when certain topics came up does not suddenly become fluent in transparency overnight. The circuitry of hiding outlasts the reason for hiding. She described this as one of the most underestimated consequences of a long deception. People expected the repentant person to be immediately restored to their original self. They were not. They were a person who had trained themselves in a particular set of relational skills designed for managing distance while performing closeness, and those skills did not simply switch off. They had to be unlearned, one interaction at a time, over months and years. This is documented in secular research as well. In Dr. Frank Pittman's clinical work, published in his 1989 book, Private Lies, Infidelity and the Betrayal of Intimacy, Pittman tracked the therapeutic outcomes of over 1,000 infidelity cases over more than 2 decades. He found that the primary long-term psychological consequence for the person who had the affair was not guilt, but dissociation, a learned splitting of the self into the person who is seen and the person who actually exists. And he found that this dissociation did not resolve automatically when the affair ended. In many cases, it intensified, because now there was no longer a second life to manage. There was only the question of how to reassemble a single self after years of functioning in 2 pieces. Teresa would have recognized every word of that. She would have said it differently. She would have called it the soul's inability to find its own face. Now let us come to what Teresa actually saw. Not just what she analyzed, what she saw. In the spring of 1572, Teresa was called to be prioress of the Monastery of the Incarnation in Avila, the same monastery she had entered nearly 40 years earlier. The community was in spiritual and financial disarray. 55 nuns were living in conditions of genuine poverty, and the interior life of the community was fractured by factions, by old resentments, by relationships that had curdled into something complicated and unspoken. Teresa arrived not as a triumphant reformer, but as someone the community initially refused to accept. They voted against her. The provincial overrode their vote, and she walked into a room of women who did not want her there. What she found inside that community was something she had seen before in smaller doses. Hidden loyalties, hidden histories. Women who had been inside the same walls for decades but were living in parallel emotional universes that never quite touched. And she identified the root of it not as malice but as unprocessed double life, the habit of keeping the important things in a room that nobody else was allowed to enter. She spent 3 years at the Incarnation. By the time she left in 1575, the community had been transformed, not by rules, not by punishment, but by what Teresa called the practice of truth before God. She made a simple demand of the women under her care. She asked them to stop managing their presentation. She asked them to pray as they actually were, not as they wished to appear. And she said, documented in the testimonies collected during her beatification process in 1614, that the first several months of this practice were agonizing for many of the women, because they had been performing their interior lives for so long that they had lost access to what was actually underneath. This is the second thing Teresa teaches about hidden affairs and the distrust they leave behind. That recovery is not about returning to what you were before. It is about learning to be present in the present tense, because the person you were before the betrayal was not fully formed either. And the version of you that got betrayed was partly constituted by a story about your relationship that turned out to be partially false. Going back to that is not healing. Going back to that is going back to a fiction. The only path forward is into a self that has been honestly rebuilt from the actual materials of your actual life. That is harder. It takes longer. Teresa knew this, and she did not offer false comfort about the timeline. If you have found this useful and you want to go deeper into documented spiritual history and its real psychological architecture, subscribe. Drop a comment with your city. This channel is where documented truth lives, and your support is what keeps it here. Now let us go deeper. Because there is a vision Teresa described that goes directly to the heart of what hidden betrayal does to the soul long after the obvious wound has begun to close. It appears in her autobiography, chapter 32, and it involves something she saw during a period of extended contemplative prayer in the summer of 1562, just months before she founded San Jose. She was praying for a person she knew, someone she did not name in the text, but whose situation she described in careful detail. This person had been in a long-term hidden relationship that had finally come to light. The discovery had been devastating, but several years had passed. The practical crisis was over. The marriage had not ended. Forgiveness had been spoken. Church had been attended. And to all outward appearances, the person was healed. But Teresa saw something else. She described a vision in which she perceived the interior of this soul the way you might perceive the interior of a house after a flood. The water was gone. The walls were standing. The furniture was back in place. But the wood of the floor was still warped. The foundations had shifted in ways that the surface did not show, and she said she understood in that moment that this was not a failure of forgiveness. The forgiveness was real. She saw it clearly, like clean air in the upper rooms of the house. But forgiveness had not repaired the structure. The structure was still damaged, and the person was living in the house as though it were sound, without knowing, or without wanting to know, that certain floors would not hold weight. What Teresa said about this vision is the most important thing in this entire story. She said the danger was not that the house would collapse dramatically. The danger was that the person would never put any real weight on those floors again. They would live a limited life inside a limited intimacy, touching only the surfaces they were sure could hold them, never going back to the depth they had been capable of before. And she said this was the true long-term cost of the hidden affair. Not the crisis, not the discovery, not even the grief, but the narrowing, the slow, permanent reduction of what a person allows themselves to feel and trust and risk. She prayed intensely for the soul, and she wrote that she received a sense of answer that was both comforting and demanding. Comforting because she understood that God did not view the narrowed life as the final word. Demanding because what God asked of the person was not just to forgive the one who had deceived them. What God asked was for them to relearn trust at the exact point where trust had been most catastrophically broken. Not with the person who had betrayed them necessarily, but with intimacy itself, with the act of being known, with the risk of being wrong again. Teresa called this the second conversion. She said the first conversion is turning away from sin. The second conversion is turning back toward the exact wound and choosing to risk it again. Not because the risk is gone. The risk is still there. The floors might not hold. Someone might deceive you again. You might be catastrophically wrong again about a person you love. Teresa did not pretend otherwise. She had been catastrophically wrong about people herself. She had trusted confessors who misled her for years, keeping her from the depth of prayer she was being called toward by insisting her experiences were diabolical rather than divine. She had trusted community members who betrayed her confidence and spread what she had said in spiritual direction into the wider community as gossip. She had lived through the fog herself. She had experienced the constriction. She had felt the slow hardening of the posture she warned others about, in her own chest, in her own hands, in the way she held herself slightly back from people who had hurt her. But she said the alternative to the second conversion is a kind of spiritual death that looks like prudence, a life so carefully calibrated to avoid pain that it has no more capacity for love either. Because love and the risk of betrayal are not separate options you can choose between. They are the same door. You open to one, you open to both. You close to one, you close to both. And a person who closes that door after betrayal is not safe. They are locked in a room with only their own fear for company. This is documented in the work of psychologist and researcher Brené Brown, whose 2010 book, The Gifts of Imperfection, and subsequent research on vulnerability, published through the University of Houston, pulls from longitudinal interview data spanning over a decade, finding that people who had experienced significant betrayal and gone on to form genuinely deep relationships afterwards had not done so by becoming more careful. They had done so by becoming more willing to be seen, less defended, more honest about their fear rather than better at hiding it. The people in her research who had the deepest connections after betrayal were not the ones who had figured out how to be more cautious, how to read warning signs earlier, how to protect themselves better. They were the ones who had decided, consciously and deliberately, that the protection was not worth the price it asked them to pay, that the price of the closed life was higher than the price of another potential wound. They walked back in, not naively. They walked back in knowing exactly what could happen, and they walked in anyway. This is not recklessness. This is exactly what Teresa described as the second conversion, the deliberate re-entry into the terrain that hurt you. And here's the thing about distrust that Teresa saw most clearly of all. Distrust does not stay in the relationship where it was born. That is the lie we tell ourselves. We say, I am just being careful now because of what happened. I'm not mistrustful of everyone, just more realistic about this particular relationship or this particular type of person. But Teresa watched it move. She watched distrust travel. She watched a woman who had been deceived by her husband carry that distrust into her prayer and find God suddenly less trustworthy. She watched a man who had been betrayed by a close friend pull back from community and from any relationship that required real vulnerability. She watched distrust become a posture rather than a response to a specific situation. And she said this was its most dangerous form, because in that form, it was invisible to the person carrying it. It felt like wisdom. It felt like experience teaching them to be less naive. It felt like growth. It felt, in fact, like a kind of maturity, like they had finally stopped being the foolish person who trusted too easily and become the clear-eyed person who understood how the world actually worked. Teresa said no. She said, this is the most dangerous disguise the wound wears. When it convinces you, it is not a wound at all. When it convinces you, it is an upgrade. But she said it was not growth. It was calcification. And calcification looks like strength from the outside and is simply hardened fear from the inside. By 1577, Teresa was under formal suspicion from the Spanish Inquisition. A denunciation had been filed against her mystical writings by a princess. She was confined to Toledo. Her foundational work was being scrutinized by men who did not understand it and were afraid of it. She was cut off from her spiritual director, John of the Cross, who had himself been abducted and imprisoned by the Chalced Carmelites in December of 1577, held in a cell in Toledo for 9 months in conditions of genuine brutality. He was given a daily ration of bread, water, and sardines. He was flogged weekly. He was forbidden light for reading or writing. Teresa wrote to him in secret. The letters did not survive, but the fact of them did, recorded in the testimony of Ana de Peñalosa, who served as intermediary. And what those letters reportedly contained, according to the accounts gathered decades later, was not comfort in the conventional sense. Teresa did not tell him his suffering would end soon. She did not promise him rescue. She told him something closer to what she had said in her own autobiography about her worst years. That the soul which has been broken and continues to seek God in the breaking is doing something more radical and more real than the soul which seeks God comfortably. That the distrust, the darkness, the inability to feel the presence of God was not a sign of abandonment. It was a sign of depth. John of the Cross escaped in August of 1578 by knotting strips of his blanket and habit into a rope, lowering himself from a window over the Tagus River Gorge, and disappearing into Toledo in the middle of the night. He had lost so much weight that his habit hung off him. He found shelter with the discalced Carmelite nuns nearby and had to be helped to walk. He wrote his greatest poems inside that cell, the first version of the spiritual canticle, The Dark Night of the Soul, which is not a metaphor for depression, but a technical mystical document about the specific experience of a soul that has been stripped of every felt certainty about God and is being asked to love in pure darkness. He wrote those poems in a cell with a slit of a window near the ceiling by whatever light came through it, on whatever scraps he could find. The poems are extraordinarily beautiful. That is not a coincidence. The beauty came from the same place as the suffering. The stripping had made room for something that the comfortable life had no space for. This is what Teresa was pointing toward in everything she saw and documented about betrayal and distrust. That the human soul has a capacity for a kind of love that does not depend on reassurance, a love that does not require proof of safety before it opens. She was not naive about pain. She had felt it all. She was not offering a shortcut through grief. There is no shortcut. She was saying that on the other side of the grief, there is a choice that many people do not know exists because nobody has described it to them honestly. The choice to stop waiting until trust is safe to give. The choice to give it in the presence of the risk, not in spite of what happened, because of it. Because the person who has been through the fire and chooses openness anyway is not the same person who was open before the fire. They are doing something harder and something more real. Teresa died on October 4th, 1582 in Alba de Tormes, in the convent she had founded there, in the arms of Ana de Bartolome, one of her closest companions. She was 67 years old. Her body was exhumed 7 months later and found to be incorrupt, fragrant, and exuding what witnesses described as an oil from the skin. Her right arm was separated and sent to Avila. Her heart, removed for examination by the canonization commissioners, was found to bear a physical wound that matched the description of the spiritual wound she had described in her autobiography, The Transverberation, in which she wrote that an angel had pierced her heart with a flaming lance. The wound was real. The pathologists could not explain it. It is documented in the official canonization records filed with Rome in 1614. Here is the thing about that wound. Teresa described the experience of the transverberation in terms that sound, if you are not listening carefully, like pure pain. She wrote that it was so great it made her cry out, that the pain was so sharp she wished it would never end. Read that again. The pain was so sharp she wished it would never end, because mixed with the pain was a sweetness, she said, no language could capture. A presence so complete that the pain itself became a form of intimacy rather than a form of damage. This is the final thing Teresa saw about hidden affairs and the distrust they leave. That the wound, if you do not run from it, if you do not manage it down to something safe and tolerable and neatly forgiven and filed away, can become the exact location of your deepest capacity. The exact place where you are most open is the exact place you are most hurt. Not because suffering is good. It is not inherently good. Suffering does not automatically produce depth or wisdom or love. Teresa was clear on this. She had known people who had suffered terribly and come out of it bitter, closed, and convinced that the world owed them caution. She did not romanticize the wound. She did not say the betrayal was secretly a gift. She said the wound was real. The damage was real. The lost years were lost. The person who deceived you was responsible for what they did, and that responsibility did not dissolve because you eventually found a way to open again. She held all of that clearly. But she also said that the places in us that break open are the places where something larger can eventually enter. The person who has never been betrayed and never had their trust shattered and never had to make the choice Teresa describes is not safer than the person who has. They are simply less tested. And the capacity they carry for love, while real, is an untested capacity. It does not yet know its own depth. The person who comes out the other side of what Teresa described, the fog, the warped floors, the calcification that looks like wisdom, the long, quiet narrowing of what you allow yourself to feel, and chooses any way to open again. That person is carrying something the untested person does not yet have, a love that has already survived its worst, a trust that has been disassembled and deliberately, painfully, one decision at a time, rebuilt. There is a detail in the canonization records from 1614 buried in the testimony of Maria de San Jose, who served with Teresa through years of reform work and accompanied her through the period of her greatest suffering. Maria was asked to describe the most striking thing she observed about Teresa in her later years. After 1577, after the confinement, after John of the Cross's imprisonment, after the years of loss and suspicion and physical deterioration, and Maria said, without hesitation, that the most striking thing was not Teresa's prayer, or her visions, or her organizational brilliance, or even her humor, which was apparently sharp and constant even in the worst years. The most striking thing, Maria said, was that she was impossible to make cautious. Despite everything that had been done to her by people she had trusted, she continued to trust new people with everything she had. She founded 7 more convents in the last 5 years of her life. She gave her full confidence to strangers who later proved worthy of it, and to some who did not. She continued to be wrong sometimes about people. She continued to be hurt. And she continued, the very next time, to open again. Maria said she once asked Teresa about this directly. She asked how she could keep trusting after everything. And Teresa told her something that was documented in the record and has been cited in scholarship ever since. She said it was very simple. She said, "I have already lost the thing I was trying to protect." That is a cold line. That is a line that takes a full minute to understand. She had already lost the thing she was trying to protect. The safety of the unlocked heart. The innocence that does not know what betrayal feels like. She had already lost it, which meant there was nothing left to lose by loving. There was only everything left to gain. The warped floors were still warped. The house was still standing.